Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. Today, I do not have a co-host. Daniel is not in town, but we'll be back tomorrow. But I want to welcome all our viewers today. I want to talk a little bit about the financial markets in connection with our foreign policy, which I think there's a lot of problems brewing, and maybe there'll be some more sudden changes on what is happening. I first got interested in watching the markets way back in the early 1970s when I was reading Austrian economics, and they were predicting that the Bretton Woods pseudo-gold standard would break down, and certainly it did in 1971. But out of frustration, I decided not to exactly run for Congress, but to speak out because I thought the monetary issue was so important and it should be addressed. And as I look back, and others are starting to agree, one of the biggest monetary events in history was the breakdown of the Bretton Woods and the disintegration of the gold standard in 1971. But I spoke out in a campaign, in a presidential campaign, in a congressional campaign that was dealing with, the Watergate year. No Republican wanted to run, and Texas was all Democrats. So I actually had an opening, and I would go out and speak at the various groups as a candidate, and not really expecting much to happen. But since that time, I've certainly kept an eye on the ups and downs, the booms and the busts, and watched out for, all the bubbles and what happens afterwards, and why monetary policy was so important. And then finally connecting not only monetary policy and economic policy, and closely connecting it to our foreign policy. And then it became very obvious what was going on. It was a connection between those who wanted to make a lot of money in banking, in commercial operation, the corporate world, the military-industrial complex. And there was a connection with this mainly because the Fed had to provide the funds because they couldn't possibly borrow this much money, and they couldn't tax enough, so they resorted to the inflation, and they've been able to get away with this for a long time. And it's been going on for a long time, and we've seen a lot of bubbles come and go. We've seen the NASDAQ bubble, and we've seen the housing bubble and the Japanese financial bubbles, and they continue. And I want to read a short quote from a well-known and a very successful investor, Jeremy Grantham. He's British, but he has a company that's located in the United States, and that's GMO. And he has been a bear. He prides himself in having detected, all the bubbles and made a lot of money out of it. So he's very astute and probably very wealthy. But in Financial Times this week, he came up, had an interview there, and he made some statements that caught my attention. I do want to read one statement to sort of set the stage for what I want to talk about. And that has to do with bubbles. And you have to realize he's been good at this and has predicted, but he's changed his mind. All of a sudden, he says, it's a new era. It's different now. There's no evidence of a bubble, which I find very interesting. So this is what he had said. He says, "I've dedicated my life to financial bubbles, and I don't think this is a bubble. This is the broadest market of all times. That is not the nature of a bubble." And he probably has some facts and figures that defends what he's saying, but to conclude that there's not a bubble, I have to say that although I'm not an asset manager, from an economic viewpoint, I have to disagree that there's many bubbles out there. It's so big that maybe you can't see the trees for the forest or something like that, because I think it's out there. Matter of fact, Mises teaches that and taught that interest rates, of course, and expansion money supply causes bubble and distortion. And a lot of times bubbles, like stock market bubbles, are easier to detect, but malinvestment, investing in the wrong places and getting too much, wouldn't necessarily have huge prices, but it would also cause problems. He argued that even an interest rate of 1% would cause distortion enough that would require a correction. But of course, we have zero rate interest rates, and we've been pumping out the money. And of course, the government's argument is there is no inflation, and yet poor people can't pay the rent, and they have and they can't keep up with their cost of living. And the stocks are very, very high. Bonds are very, very high. So to me, I see bubbles everywhere I look, and I anticipate that we are going to see these corrections. And the big question I always get out on the speech tours is, yeah, this sounds good and it sounds right, but tell us when it's going to happen, which I'm not going to do that because I don't know, and nobody knows that, because the event that precipitates the desire for more than a couple people making a correction and taking advantages of excessive prices, it's unknown. It's been called a black swan event. Just can pop up and change people's attitude. So although there's a lot of objective factors involved in the building of bubbles, like monetary policy and what government does and how they direct the money to be spent, it's also something that you can't really predict exactly how long it will last, because there's a subjective factor. There's objective factors that you know long term, but the subjective factors enter into exactly where the money goes. Because that we have been working the last 10 years on old notions that pump up the money supply. That's how we've gotten out of our recessions and depressions. We just pump up the money supply, and the people finally liquidate a bit of their debt and they go back to investing. So they figure, well, this is a bad recession, and this is the Great Recession. So we're going to need a lot of money, and certainly they poured it out, a lot of money. But what they couldn't predict is where it would go. They thought, well, we'll do that, and if we pump it into the banks and stocks, it's all going to dribble down, and there'll be a higher demand, and there'll be more production and more jobs. Well, it didn't work. It didn't work. The money went elsewhere because their computer projections of what people would do didn't know what people would do and where the money would go. And of course, it went into areas that just made the rich richer, made more billionaires than ever before. We're getting companies now that are trillionaires, and yet 50% of our population are still suffering. So we still have a lot of distortion out there, but also along with this, we have a tremendous amount of debt. There's a debt overhang. Even if you're not paying huge amount of interest on this debt, paying back the debt is necessary, but a lot of people are paying a lot of interest because the interest that is paid is usually paid for by the consumer. If an average person doesn't borrow a lot of money and doesn't have a house, they think, I'm not paying any interest. But all products have that worked into it. So if the corporations are either taxed or have to pay interest, that is all worked into charging that to the consumer. But in the last 8 years, under Obama, the national debt doubled from 10 to 20 trillion dollars. Right now, there's a household debt of $12 trillion, and that is not going to be paid for. It's going to be liquidated. But we have the stock market sky high. We have the bond prices sky high. And if you want to look at one little old item, you could look at Bitcoin. That's something that, I don't know if anybody fully understands exactly what's going on or how long that'll last. I'm skeptical. I'm certainly in support of the legality of it if people don't cheat and steal, but I don't believe it really serves the purpose of money. It's not a store of value. It can be facilitate exchanges, and I think that's what it's doing. But it's gone up 200% this year. And that means that people have a lot of money and a lot of dollars, and they're shifting them around. And this facilitator, the Bitcoin, is valuable in facilitating. But where did the Bitcoin come from? And that, of course, is another story. You can't put a Bitcoin in your pocket. And I was raised in a tradition where I thought you should be able to put your money with value in your pocket. And if you wanted to store it because you didn't trust the banks because they might close down, you ought to be able to put it in your shoebox or something else. But Bitcoins, you can't do that. You can't, in a desperate situation, you can't carry your computer around and get bailed out by saying, here, take your computer and you're going to be a wealthy person. That's why I'm skeptical, but I certainly think that it should be permissible. Now, we have this tremendous imbalance in the economy, tremendous amount of debt. We have a sluggish economy, half of the people, suffering and getting way behind, and yet there's a lot of danger signs out there and what's going to happen. This is not a phenomenon in the United States. This has been going on. This is what's unique in history. It's been going on essentially since 1971, when dollar literally was declared king, and we were spared the disasters of the wars in our homeland, not financially, but we were spared, and we had the strongest economy, and the strength of our economy was able to take care of the Soviet system. They had too much debt, and they finally collapsed. They didn't have enough economic activity to compensate. We did, and so we've been pumping out the dollars, and we get a lot for it. Just this week, the Chinese said, what we want to do is keep buying, more of U.S. debt, and this, of course, was a signal that the two countries are behind the scenes at least recognizing that we hear them screaming and hollering about the trade balance with China. No, there's a balance of payments with China. We're glad to buy stuff, and if they have money, they're making it very clear, we're going to keep buying your debt. So we go to China to borrow money, and it keeps things going. But the Chinese government has to say certain things. Our government says certain things to show that we're nationalistic and that we're not going to have people push around and not let people know how desperate we are, that we have to borrow money from the Chinese to keep going. But it's very fragile. Europe is fragile, but the dollar's involved all the time. When the crisis hit in 2008 and 2009, it became necessary for the big bailouts had to come from elsewhere other than the Congress. Sure, the Congress spent billions, but the Fed pumped out trillions of dollars to prop up this dollar system. And the dollar system, survived it all to this degree, but it did it by just keeping pumping and building a much bigger bubble. So I not only see bubbles almost every place I look, in the bond market and in the stock market, I see it in the dollar market, the worldwide dollar market, because this dependency on debt is so out of control. There's the bond markets are huge, and 54% of the bonds had to be bought by central banks. And the central banks' credit, of course, they create credit, but what they hold in reserve are dollars. So this is huge, and I don't think anybody fully understands how this can become unraveled. They say, well, it couldn't happen. We don't even see any bubbles anymore because this is so different. We see that that stocks and all will continue because some price and earning ratios look pretty good, and there's going to be continued growth, and not paying a lot of attention to the people who are falling behind, the homeless now. Our big cities have had tens of thousands of people that are homeless. They don't have the money to pay for rent. Even if they have a job, they can become homeless because they don't have enough money because rents are too high. Then they say there's no inflation. Well, the cost of living is high. In a city like New York and a city like Los Angeles, cost of living is very high. They can't pay the rent, and even the food prices are high. But our government tells us no inflation. Well, the main job we have is for the Federal Reserve to create more inflation. The problem is there's not enough inflation. Inflation is an indication of economic growth. And that's a bunch of baloney. Why wasn't Zimbabwe and Venezuela doing real well? They had a lot of inflation. So that is total nonsense. And yet, 100% of the activity in these last several years, maybe even 8 years, the whole purpose of the Federal Reserve was to stimulate inflation, get prices going up, and that would be a sign that there's economic growth. It didn't work, and they hide it, and they distort the views, they distort the financial reports on unemployment. There's probably close to 1 million people that are out of the workforce now, and yet the unemployment rate is 4.3%. So nobody's suffering. And there's a market out there. They say there are so many jobs and no applicants, and we're in boom times. Well, there's one person who proved that some of that was nonsense, and that's Donald Trump, because he maybe was listening and knew what was going on to what they were talking about in the government, but he went to the people who felt left out, and that is a large number of people, and they were independents and Democrats and Republicans, and it was his empathy for these people that just far outclassed the classical expectation of the Democrats that they were always supposed to be the empathizers and taking care of the working class. So what do we have to look at in foreign policy? Well, there's lots of stuff, and on this report, we talk about it all the time. We talk about Syria, we talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, 16 years of war there, constantly going on. But this week, there was an interesting incident that happened, and that the $80 billion we spend on intelligence gathering and the hundreds of billions of dollars that we have in our military, nobody said, guess what? There's going to be a major change in policy in Garda, and they're going to be rejected by their neighbors, Saudi Arabia and others, and they all broke relations, diplomatic relations with Garda, which is a big event. And they said, well, it's because Garda is supporting the terrorists. So here it is. We have the Saudis who are ganging up together. We participating in a war against Yemen, and then saying, well, Garda has to be punished because they've been too friendly, with the terrorists. And then they applied, well, they actually even talked to the people in Iran, and this is a major problem. So it's so hypocritical. Nobody really talked much about what goes on in the Middle East because they get ridiculed back when they were trying to getting ready to start the war in Iraq. It was always, Saddam Hussein was killing his people, Assad is gassing his people, and on and on we have to go, and we're the exceptional nations, we're going to take care of that. And but then a few, and they were painted as far left as they say it's all about oil. And it was a lot about oil. It was a lot about religion and other things. But oil was a big deal. And the military-industrial complex, that was a big deal too, and it still is, even right now. But some claim that, and I think this is what happened, Trump went over there and he over-identified with Saudi Arabia, and this, pointed out some differences with Garda and gave them an excuse to say, well, it's all about terrorism, yet it's probably all about natural gas. Where are the pipelines going to go? So money still talks, and banking still talks, and selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, that still talks. And, so our corporations and our banks and our governments are very happy, with all this. So there is an event, coming that will suddenly change this whole setting, and the bubbles will burst. And if it lets air out slowly over a period of time, it could be handled, but unfortunately, most bubbles burst and let all the air out at one time. Even this week, there's some activities going on. There's an election, in Britain. There's some European Central Bank meetings going on. There's some hearings going on this week with Comey, and people will be watching that. So there might be some other event, but that is what is unpredictable. But I think it is safe to say that on long term, the policy that we have of spending, running up debt, and telling other people how to live, and getting involved and making enemies and making excuses for doing what we're doing for regime change. There's even a hint today about regime change in Garda, because they're not coming together. They're not supporting, the Saudi, Israeli, U.S. policies of being uniformly opposed to, Iran. Something like this, this would be, I think, catastrophic if all of a sudden there is a regime change in Garda. But those are the kind of things that float around. But even without one of those particular events, the bubble can't last. The bubble is there. It isn't any different financially that bubbles burst. but it doesn't, it is different. Each bubble is different, has a different characteristic, the length of time and who it affects and this sort of thing and what precipitates it. And that is what is unknown. But I do not believe they've just outlawed bubbles and that we're going to have perpetual prosperity. Right now, we already know we don't have the prosperity. So it used to be that the new era said prosperity for everybody and it was going to last forever and everybody was going to be happy. That is not the case. We live in a very dangerous time financially, and yes, the foreign policy is horrible. But if we changed our monetary policy and said that that which you can't afford by either borrowing and borrowing and taxing, you shouldn't be doing it. Matter of fact, you shouldn't be able to borrow. That you should not be permitted to print the money, no matter how well received that money is throughout the world. And that, in one sense, was a gift to us, but it was also a very dangerous gift because we'll have to pay it back one way or the other. So I think it's fascinating. I think it's very interesting. I don't think it's complex. I think big government, big banking, and fiat money, all these things fully explains the difficulties that we have throughout the world. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.